In this video, I'm going to tell you about some really cool DIY fighting game controllers. These are some DIY-friendly all-button controllers that you can build for yourself. I will also be taking a look at many of the awesome features offered by the GP2040 CE firmware for game controllers. Stay tuned. I love playing fighting games. The only problem is, I'm not very good. Have you ever seen that meme that's like, man too good at fighting games to play with friends but not good enough to go pro? That's a pretty good approximation of my skill level. So what's the best thing to do when you're faced with what's very obviously a skill issue? Just blame your controller. All jokes aside, it doesn't matter if you play fighting games on a gamepad, a keyboard, or a fight stick, at some point you will probably think about trying a different controller. So I've been thinking about trying a new fight stick for a while just to change things up. One day, I was scrolling through the new uploads page on printables, like I find myself doing quite often. Purely by coincidence, I came across this beautiful design. This Hitbox style controller was designed by Marshall Swan. I love the stylish look of this little controller, so of course I had to print one out. Now, if you've seen my other videos, you probably already know that I love to tinker and change things around. I really love the original design of this controller, but I want to change it to work with the hardware that I already have. So let's take a look at all of my changes to the original model. By the way, I have already uploaded my remix of this design, and the original creator is very cool with it. So thanks again to Marshall Swan for allowing remixes. So here are the things that have been changed. The overall width of the finished product has been changed to 216 millimeters. This allows for easier printing on smaller 3D printers, so if you have something like an Ender 3 or a Voxelab Aquila, you should be good to go. The buttonhole size has been changed to 24 millimeters exactly in diameter. This was done to accommodate a different printable arcade switch that has a really tight fit. The bottom of the controller has been completely redesigned. This change eliminates the optional shell that was included with the original model, but it keeps the styling of the original design. The top body now fits inside the bottom body. The 4 bolts that hold the device together have been changed to M3 bolts and can be threaded directly into the plastic if desired. The USB-C breakout mount has been modified to use M3 bolts. With this design, no glue is required. The standoffs for the Raspberry Pi Pico have been relocated and made longer. These long standoffs can be melted to hold the Pi in place. The 5 menu buttons have been changed to a cheap 8mm momentary switch. I'm going to be using some cheap switches that I found on Amazon. I have also designed this little switch riser plate to change the mounting depth of those switches. The buttons included in this model are also a remix. Here's the original creator. The button housings have been modified to make the top ring flatter and more low profile. And the button caps are the ones that are designed by Raina Labs. I'm going to leave a link to all of the credited creators in the video description. I ended up making a few different versions of this controller, so you can choose the configuration that fits you best. There's a version with the typical Hitbox layout, and a version that supports 30mm thumb buttons. I have also created remixes of the mixbox version of this controller, which is available with no thumb button, a 24mm thumb button, or a 30mm thumb button. Most recently, I have added a new version of each of these controllers that relocates the 5 menu buttons to the top side of the controller to make room for a 128x64 OLED screen. All of these STL files are available for free on my printables page. Please look for the links in the video description. To assemble this project, you will need to get some of your favorite Cherry MX keyboard switches. For the menu buttons, I'm going to use some of these very cheap 8mm momentary switches. You will also need 6 M3 12mm bolts, one of these little USB-C breakouts that I use in everything, and for the brain of this project, we'll be using a Raspberry Pi Pico. If you're making one of the versions that includes the OLED screen, you will need to get one of these 128x64 OLED displays. These are sold as a 0.96 inch display. I'll have an affiliate link to all of these products in the description below this video. Now I'm going to show you how each part of this controller prints out. Here is a print bed. The top piece prints out face down. The one shown here is the mixbox layout. It has the WASD or arrow keys. For this version, you will need supports underneath those keys. The bottom part of this controller prints out right side up with no supports required. The buttons are pretty interesting. They actually print out in 3 separate pieces. Then the button mount and the button nut thread together like this. I've been printing these button mounts upside down with supports on the inside. And the nut prints out with a large flat side against the print bed with no supports. The button caps print out best upside down with the flat side against the print bed. This little trim piece was included with the original Mixbox model. It prints out very well without supports face down like this. I made this switch riser to change the mounting depth of the switches. You can see I've done a simple filament color change to make it look cool. You can print this piece without supports face up.
What if you want to build a controller but you don't have a 3D printer of your own? Well, let me tell you about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by PCBWay. Are you a passionate creator looking to bring your next idea to life? PCBWay has got you covered. At PCBWay.com, you can easily order custom PCBs and 3D prints. Their streamlined platform offers instant quotes, expert support, and competitive prices. PCBWay.com ships globally, delivering quality products to your doorstep. Their fast and reliable service lets you stay focused on your projects. PCBWay.com can help you turn your ideas into reality. That's PCBWay.com. Prototype the easy way.
Before installing the Raspberry Pi Pico, head over to the Downloads page on the GP2040CE website and download the firmware. While holding down the Boot Select button, plug the Raspberry Pi Pico into your computer. If this is done correctly, you will see a storage device appear on your computer labeled RPI-RP2. You can drag and drop the firmware UF2 file onto the internal storage of the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi storage device will automatically eject itself from the computer, and the green light on the Raspberry Pi will illuminate, showing that programming was successful. Now it's time to get this controller all wired up. I'm going to start off by creating a connection to ground. Every switch in this controller will need to be connected to ground. I will connect the left leg of each switch together using a black wire. If you look closely at the Raspberry Pi Pico, you will notice that some of the pins are shaped differently. These square pins can be used for a ground connection. It's a good idea to keep the Raspberry Pi Pico pinout diagram handy for projects like this. Up next, I will run wires for the up, down, left, and right keys. Since the up key and the thumb button will both be bound to the jump action, I will connect both of their switches to the same pin. Now is probably a good time to mention that you can actually rebind these pin assignments in the GP2040CE firmware. I will be using the default pin assignments that are shown on the GP2040CE website, even though the buttons can always be changed around later. Anyway, the right leg of the up, down, right, and left switches get wired to pins GP2, 3, 4, and 5 respectively.
Next, I'll wire the bottom row of arcade buttons. B1, B2, R2, and L2 get connected to pins GP6, 7, 8, and 9. If those button names sound odd to you, please take a look at this handy chart on the GP2040CE website. It translates the button names to their game controller equivalents. For the top row of buttons, B3, B4, R1, and L1 get wired to pins GP10, 11, 12, and 13. I'm using a different color wire for each of the menu buttons to make it easier to see how they're wired up. S1 and S2 are connected to GP16 and 17. L3, R3, and A1 are connected to pins GP18, 19, and 20. Keep in mind, these menu switches also need to be connected to a grounding point. For the OLED screen to work, the power pin must be connected to the 3 volts out pin on the Raspberry Pi, shown here in red. The ground connection must be connected to a grounding point, shown here in black. The clock and data pins must be connected to 2 consecutive GPIO pins. In this example, I'm using GP26 for data by connecting it to the SDA pin on the OLED screen with a purple wire. GP27 gets connected to the SCL pin on the OLED screen with a yellow wire. The last component to add is the USB-C port. This little breakout board is held in place with 2 bolts. To get the USB-C connection going, I'm going to sacrifice the Raspberry Pi's micro USB cable. There are 4 wires inside the USB cable. The red wire gets connected to VBus, the black wire gets connected to ground, the white wire gets connected to data minus, the green wire gets connected to data plus. You will notice there are 2 unused pins on the USB-C breakout board. If you have compatibility issues with certain cables or devices, you can connect a 5.1 kilo ohm resistor from each of these pins to ground. In my limited testing, this has never been necessary. I have some 3D printed low profile keycaps to throw on here. Of course, you could always use some manufactured keycaps in whatever profile you prefer. Now I need to make some changes in the firmware so the OLED screen will work. The GP2040CE firmware has a web configurator that can be accessed by holding down the S1 button while plugging in the controller. Then open up a web browser and navigate to the IP address 192.168.7.1. This will open up the web configurator. To get the LCD screen running, we need to click on the configuration tab and go to display configuration. Make sure that the hardware options are enabled and select the correct I2C block. The Raspberry Pi Pico has 2 I2C blocks. For the screen to work correctly, the clock and data pins must be connected to 2 consecutive GPIO pins. Check out the light blue labels on this Raspberry Pi Pico pinout diagram. I'm using pins GP26 and 27, so I will need to use I2C1. Now we can go back to the configuration tab and select peripheral mapping. This is where the correct pins for the LCD screen are assigned. So here I'm just going to make sure I2C1 is turned on and that the pins are assigned the same way that they're wired up inside my controller. Don't forget to click the save button. If you want, you can go ahead and reboot the controller now. These settings should allow the OLED screen to work the next time the controller is plugged in. There are lots of other cool features that you can customize with the GP2040CE firmware. You can upload a custom splash screen. Here you can see a simple one that I made. If anyone's interested in a short video on how to make graphics like this, please let me know in the comments section. You can customize the way your buttons are displayed on the screen too. There are lots of different layouts included with this firmware that will support a variety of controller configurations. The firmware supports 13 different input modes: X input, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, direct input, and keyboard input are all supported here. Input latency with this controller has an average of 0.76 milliseconds in X input mode and about 0.91 milliseconds on a PlayStation 5. I would encourage you to go check out the GP2040CE website for a lot more information about performance and how it's measured. The firmware also supports turbo mode. You may not need this for most fighting games, but it would be useful in some arcade games or as an accessibility feature. If you want a very vibrant controller design, you can configure per button RGB LEDs. I may have to add this feature to my controller sometime in the future. The firmware has a very rich set of features, including some that are beyond the scope of this video or intended for niche controllers. That being said, I would definitely encourage you to check out the GP2040 CE documentation, or if you have a spare Pi laying around, flash it and explore the configurator. Hey, I wanted to give you a quick rundown of how these controllers work, just in case you're not familiar with how hitboxes work. So these controllers are called leverless, stickless, or all-button controllers. Basically, the joystick's inputs are mapped to a directional arcade button. The mixbox button layout is pretty self-explanatory, but the hitbox is a little different. The bottom button is actually up, or jump, and this middle button is actually down. You could flip these in the fighting game input settings, but this is the standard configuration. This layout's optimized for fighting game inputs. Having each direction broken out into its own button makes it easier to dial in input sequences without errors. For example, a Hadouken in Street Fighter is quarter, circle, and punch, so that button sequence would be down, down right, right, and then punch. Once you get used to a hitbox, the inputs are very consistent. To summarize, I thought this was a really fun project. Most of the parts were relatively cheap and easy to find. Also, the firmware is not overly complicated to set up. If you have any interest in video games or just tinkering with electronics, I would definitely recommend trying to build your own controller, even if it's not just a dedicated fight stick. Thanks again to the contributors to the GP2040 CE firmware and to the creators of the original 3D models that inspired me to make this video in the first place. Now, those of you that are still watching the video may be wondering, does the new controller make you any better at video games? Well, all you have to do to find that out is go follow my Twitch channel over at twitch.tv/modulus. That's twitch.tv/M0DULUS. If you can ever catch me live streaming, come on in and ask a few questions about any of my projects. And who knows, maybe you'll catch me working on something new. If you think DIY controllers are cool, go ahead and click the like button and also click the subscribe button. Share this video with all your Discord buddies that are always blaming their controller. Be sure to check my other links in the description of the video. But that's all for now, so thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay mad.